All right. Hi, everyone. We are so excited today to present to you the first of our series in the Shake the Table series. We're going to be discussing feminist leadership in college. This is a partnership between the Leadership Center and the Women's Center. So before we do anything else, we do want to introduce our speakers today. My name is Jessica Roshak, and I'm the Assistant Director for Student Leadership Development. I'm going to toss it over to Haley to introduce yourself, and then Cassie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Corley. I currently serve as the Graduate Assistant for Leadership Development in the Leadership Center.
And my name is Cassie Peg Kirby. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the Director of the Women's Center.
All right, so we're so excited that y'all are tuning in virtually. This is a series that we're doing in the Leadership Center as well as recording so that folks can watch it later on. So we're happy that you're tuning in. So what we're going to talk about today, so we're going to do just a quick introduction to the series so that you understand kind of why we're doing this and what you can expect to gain from the workshops that we're putting on. We're going to talk a little bit about gender identity in leadership. And so this is really the piece of this that's the big takeaway from the series overall is gender does play a role in some way in our leadership development. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that could look like. We're going to talk about the waves of feminism because this is discussing feminist leadership in college. And so we want to set the stage for what has gotten us to the point that we are today and what that looks like in reality. And then we'll talk a little bit about the future of the series. So what you can expect from after today and on for the next few workshops. We've got a lot in store for you this semester. So we hope to see you at a few of these. So before we go any further, we do want to kind of set the stage. So I want you to consider a few of these things. So traits associated with male and female identifying leaders look a little bit different. And so when we hear traits that are associated with male leaders, if we were in person, we would do a quick survey to see what you all think, but here are a few that commonly come up. We hear things like assertive, professional, willing to take risks, work well under pressure, highly motivated, that are seen as the go-getters, are persuasive. I would say that these lend to traditional leadership traits. I don't know that these need to have a gender, but when we're asked about male leaders, these are typically some words that come to mind. Now, when we ask about female leadership, we tend to get very different responses. You might hear things like empathetic or motherly, compassionate, nurturing, honest, respectful, leading with their hearts, all of which are wonderful traits and I do think align really well with some strong leaders that I can think of, but they can also be taken in a negative light. You know, the men think with their heads and the women think with their hearts. There is just a little bit of a difference within there. And we see that in society. We see that in the way that gender may shape your experience as a leader. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how this came to be and what this may look like. So why are we here? You know, I've talked a little bit about this thus far, but the Women's Center and the Leadership Center, we see a lot of things on this campus. And so one of the things we wanted to address is just starting this conversation about the way that gender identity can shape your leadership traits, your leadership experiences, may help you to identify with what leadership positions you want to take on. And we want to ultimately create a space on campus where we're more inclusive as leaders, that these opportunities don't necessarily have challenges associated with your gender, but that we can embrace these differences and the things that we bring to the table so that we can shake it up a little bit and make this a place where everybody can thrive in their leadership positions. So Cassie is going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about these waves of feminism and how that has played out in our society. But what does this look like here? You know, how are women and men that identify in those capacities treated differently? How does gender shape our experiences? So I'm going to pose a few scenarios, and I just want you to think about, have you ever encountered these yourself? Or do you know folks that have encountered these scenarios on our campus? So let's think about this first one. You are the only woman on a team working on a group project in class. The teacher suggests that someone in your group take notes. Your group members all turn to you and hand you a pen. Now, what's setting you apart from the rest of your group members? Why do people immediately turn to you? You know, there can be a myriad of reasons for that, but typically when it comes to more secretarial duties, women are looked to first because that's how people associate us and our leadership abilities. Let's think of another one. You make a worthwhile contribution in class and everyone seems to ignore it. A few minutes later, a man makes a similar comment and everyone remarks on how clever he is. I've seen this play out many, many times in my life where, again, you say something very similar to another person, but perhaps because of an identity that they hold, people think about what they've said in a different light. They may lean a little bit more towards that or dismiss you. We see this come up a lot. And so I think many of us might resonate with this one. Another could be, you care deeply about women's issues and stay involved in your community. Your friends and family refer to you as the feminazi. We hear this quite a bit on our campus as well. And this is one of the things that we talked a bit about when we were trying to name this series. We were very intentional about talking about feminist leadership in college, but we also understand that some people have this deeply rooted vision of what feminism looks like. And we're hoping we can break down some of those stereotypes. Then the last one I would ask you to consider is you and your friends get into a heated argument about a topic you have a passion for. They laugh and ask if you are on your period, because that can be the only reason that you get upset or passionate about something. So these may be just some ways that you might see gender shaping leadership experiences or just general group working together experiences. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what these may look like, how gender does play into this. And then again, Cassie will highlight some different experiences in these waves of feminism that you may also identify with. So I'm going to toss it over to Haley to get into this next portion of our presentation.
Okay, go ahead. Next slide, Jess. So like Jessica said, I'm going to talk a little bit about gender identity and leadership. So if you're not familiar with the term social constructs are things that are created by our society over time, and they can change. So thinking about gender and leadership, our ideas of what gender means and our ideas of what leadership means have both been constructed by society and have changed over time. Going with that, socialization to society's preferred genders and leadership identities. So those stereotypes that Jessica was mentioning, or having like a gender binary, for example, a false gender binary, those are socialized in us at a very early age and come from a multitude of sources. So you may remember growing up and having traditional roles, maybe as a child, or traditional stereotypes given to you within your gender. And those came from a multitude of sources, whether it's the media, your family, your friends, and no one does it intentionally, hopefully not. But socialization to this binary or this idea of gender and leadership as a social construct happened at an early age. Same thing with the terms that Jessica was sharing earlier that are associated with male and female leadership. A lot of those come from our perceptions of the media or those around us or things that are shared with us early on. And are socialized for us to believe. If we are able to understand these and how these socially constructed identities interact and intersect, we can start to break down some of those false binaries. So male versus women leadership or male versus feminine traits. And we can start to break down those barriers that prevent us from seeing leadership as more of an accessible opportunity for all to enjoy, rather than this binary that only men can be strong leaders or women have to have leadership in a certain construct. So allowing us to understand gender and leadership as these social constructs can really give us power as we start to understand the how history has shaped leadership and where we're going from here with feminism and leadership together. And if we were in person today, I would have you turn to a partner and look at these questions. So before we move on, I want you to take a second to look at these questions and write down some answers. So I would encourage you to pause your video and answer the following. So what gender and cultural identities and experiences are most salient for you? So think about your identities, where you show up and what is most important to you in that regard. The second question, do you feel that gender influences your assumptions about leadership? If so, how? So thinking back to your experiences, has gender played a role in your leadership? And then the last one, have gendered experiences shaped you as a leader? If so, share some examples. So thinking about your leadership journey, how has that gender really played into your growth as a leader? So again, we encourage you to take a few moments, pause and reflect. And then when you're ready, you can go ahead and hit play.
Okay, I guess you're tossing it to me, Haley. So I wanted to go through some things, some waves of feminism. I think this is something that a lot of folks are familiar with. I will tell you that some people contest this idea that there are waves of feminism and think more along the lines of these things overlap. So it's not one wave that stops and then another wave starts. It's really this sort of, it starts with one thing, you recognize some of the challenge or the shortcomings, acknowledge the progress that's been made, and then think about what the next push is going to be. So when we think of it, I hope you can look at this idea of waves of feminism a little bit loosely. I also want to share, both Jessica and Haley mentioned when we're thinking about, we were careful in thinking about how we wanted to title this, because oftentimes people will think of women's leadership or men's leadership in certain ways. And we knew also if we termed it as feminist leadership, that carries its own connotation. So I just want to dispel a couple of things. I know we'll get to this, but with feminism, sometimes people will think, and we'll see why as we look through the waves, but sometimes people think like, oh, those are folks are anti-men, or those folks want to be like men, or there's all sorts of things that can come up. And when you're thinking about leadership, oftentimes people look at it like, oh, so you want a bunch of women in these leadership positions instead of men, which representation is important, but I also want you to consider feminist leadership looks at the whole structure. So we're not talking about replacing men in leadership with women and having women lead over people. We're talking about this idea of leading with, which is a very different way of looking at leadership from what most of us are used to. And leading with is about feminist leadership. It's about integrating heart, mind, and body. It's about that difference of leading over and leading with, and also thinking about everyone having value and having a voice and having an opportunity to participate. So sorry, I went off on a little tangent, but this is just a passion of mine because I think it's really interesting to look at it that way and think about not just changing the people in the places, but changing the very way we look at and expect leaders to show up and look like. So with that, I'll go on to my waves of feminism. So most people talk about three waves, and we've been talking about this fourth wave, which we're not, because I think it's still potentially continuing, there's a lot of sort of fluidity on where we're at with that. But the first wave is the mid 1800s to the early 1900s. The second wave would be taking us through civil rights, the 1960s through the 1980s. The third wave starting more with the 1990s, and then the fourth wave looking at 2010 potentially and moving forward sort of indefinitely. We all had this very interesting pause in our lives the past couple of years. So, so we'll see how that progresses forward. But if you want to switch to the next slide, I'll start. So I shared some pictures in here just to give, something else to look at, but also to give you some perspective. A couple of things, as you notice from here, these women, from what I can tell, are probably all white. You also can see that this quote is pretty interesting. No self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her sex. And that was Susan B. Anthony. And so you can see there were women out there sort of protesting a lot of different important things at that time that we really sort of stand on the shoulders of these women in many ways for what they've accomplished. So if you want to go to the next slide. So some key issues of this time, this first wave of feminism that I mentioned is the mid 1800s to the early 1900s, was the suffrage movement, the right to vote. And so that was a really important push, because prior to that, women didn't have the right to vote. And you think about how often we talk about how important it is to vote, right? That's how you use your voice to impact change, by voting people in or out of office, by being able to sort of leverage what's important to you. There were also issues of property ownership. So, at that time, women couldn't own property, and that made a difference in terms of inheritance and ability to, in terms of your ability to be on your own without a male companion. And there also were some reform movements. Some individuals you may have heard of would be Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper. And I encourage you to look up the ones that you're not familiar with. Oftentimes, if we've talked about in other capacities, only, what is it, the victors tell the story in most cases, but I think it's also the people in privilege and power tend to tell the stories. So there's a lot of voices and a lot of folks who were really doing incredible work at this time that you may not be familiar with. And I would encourage you to look into those. I am excited to see things like, oh, I'm not sure how excited I am. I think it was a Barbie, but there was an Ida B. Wells Barbie at the grocery store, like Black History Month. We're going to celebrate, and to see some of those folks that have not been recognized to be recognized. Again, I'm not sure that a Barbie is the right way to do that, but I'm glad to see it out there sort of in the mainstream. Some of the challenges with this first wave, as I mentioned, mostly white and mostly middle class. This particular time, you'll hear, particularly last year, the 1920 was when women earned the right to vote. But in 2020, at the 100th anniversary, there was a lot of really concern about how to celebrate that right, because it was precarious, because race and gender at certain points were fractured, and much because, from my understanding, white women wanting to move forward with this felt like they couldn't do it if they didn't separate out some of these other issues. And there were some biases at that time that were really layered in there. So I don't want to say that the whole movement, like throw it out, it wasn't valuable, but I think we need to look at it with open eyes and consider that things can be both and. They can be wonderful and important movements forward, but let's look at it with open eyes and acknowledge the things that are precarious, and how can we learn from that as we move forward and make some changes. So from there, we had the second wave of feminism. And this, I think this was my mom, so I'm not sure where that fits with all of you, but I think this was, growing up in the 70s and 80s, these were sort of what I came from, and my familiarity with the women's rights movement. So you can see some of the folks there, and you can see it's changed a little bit in terms of when you saw that scope of the people that were involved in walking together and involved in that, the people pictured there look a little different than maybe the group we saw in the first wave, not just because their sense of fashion either, there's some other things in there. But so some key issues of this were the Equal Rights Amendment. And I have been doing some research for my own benefit to take a look at this, because the Equal Rights Amendment technically hasn't passed. It was pushed through, and it was, it had to be ratified by the states, and not enough states ratified it. And so you'll see this pop up, in different spaces, the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, this was started back in the second wave of feminism. They were fighting for equal pay. I think about, now we're talking about, even in this experience with COVID, how it's been pushing back a lot of the progress that had been made with equal pay. One of the things that we're recognizing with equal pay is we think about, for white women at this point, they have to work a year and then till April. And I'm talking about today, not when this was started. I'm talking today, to earn the same amount of money a white man makes in 1 year. For Black women, they have to work a whole year, and then all the way to August, another 9 months. So while progress was made, a lot of the progress was raising awareness about this. There was, Lily Ledbetter, there's some different folks that was actually from this area. If you look her up, there was, strides made in terms of raising awareness. Women were in the workforce. What is this? And I'll say white women were in the workforce. There hasn't been the same distinction in many ways for Black women who have been in the workforce potentially much longer. But the equal pay has been an issue since back in the day. So we're still fighting that battle. Reproductive rights, if you think about all the legislation that's coming through right now, these are battles that started in the 1960s, and we're still tangling with the idea of birth control, access to abortion. In this time, women were only allowed to have birth control if they were married. And and so much was based on the permission of your husband. Certainly single women didn't have access to birth control. And so this was a really, an interesting sort of push. And then obviously Roe versus Wade and reproductive rights and access to abortion. Some notable folks you may have heard about: Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Bell Hooks, who unfortunately just passed away recently, Angela Davis. There's a group called the Combahee River Collective. And so I would encourage you to look that up, because again, one of the sort of undertones that much of this movement is built on, but doesn't get a whole lot of recognition. It was, I got to see a conference where they talked about from Combahee River Collective to Black Lives Matter, and talked about sort of the rudimentary start of a lot of these conversations about the intersection of identities between race, sex, class, sexuality, all of that in the Combahee River Collective. In terms of the challenges, I mentioned some of these in terms of people perceptions of what the women's rights movement was all about. The women's rights movement became associated with angry, man-hating, and lonely women. There's a lot of, you look up some of the marketing or the media of that time that capitalized on that. As I mentioned earlier, we're still fighting some of the same issues. And, there's conversations about Black women feeling disenfranchised from the civil rights movement and from the women's movement. So we really started to talk about Black women having their own identity that didn't necessarily fit into either of these movements, because they were both complicated with power and privilege. And in the civil rights movement, you saw a lot more of the male leadership in those areas. In the women's movement, they were, again, race became an issue and weren't included or elevated in the way they should have been, based on who held the power and the privilege. So then we're on to the third wave. And this may be stuff that you're more familiar with. You can see some signs there that maybe look familiar. Again, this one, the folks are changing. I see some people who look like they're men in this space. So, what this movement's about, again, is broadening and bringing more people into it. So some of the, the key folks, if you want to go to the next slide, some of the key folks in this movement: Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas is still a Supreme Court justice. So if you want to look up Anita Hill and find out more about her story, that was in 1991. It was about sexual harassment, and that was a very big case at that time. Riot Girl is, again, just folks that I would encourage you to look up: Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, and Judith Butler, who wrote some things around gender construct and gender identities and really sort of broke down some of those barriers. Key issues, you're seeing some that keep filtering through, right? Reproductive rights, access to abortion, the reclamation of derogatory terms. So like we had the slut walk, and we had different things that really this was in the 1990s, where people were like, we're going to take that name back. You want to call me that and act like it's derogatory? I'm going to own that. Fine. I'm going to, we're going to get out there and we're going to wear what we want and say what we want and do what we want and own it. Again, the sexual liberation too, some of that. And I think you'll see that, as I said, with people being like, this isn't for the male gaze. I'm like this because I believe in my sexuality and I have every right to show up in this way. We've let men sort of own their sexuality. I'm going to own mine and feel comfortable in it and not be afraid to show that. There was a little bit more, inclusion of race, class, and gender. I think that what we saw from the second wave, really people were saying, we can't do this work unless this is central to the conversation. I'm not saying we're there yet, but people are tackling some of those issues and thinking about some of those things more. The challenges, if you look at what's trying to be accomplished in this third wave, there was no, they weren't rallying around equal pay or rallying around the right to vote. There were a lot of different things happening at this time. And unfortunately, there was no legislation to show for their efforts. So there was not any kind of legislation that could mark this time, like the 1920s right to vote, or, the working through the Equal Rights Amendment or Title IX or Roe versus Wade, or some of those things that were thought of as, as having accomplished something to get not only a movement going and conversations going, but also to get some legislation on the books for some hopeful protection if utilized correctly. So then we come into the fourth wave, which is where many of you probably are, showing up in this space. And intersectionality is at the core of this, right? Like we start talking about, you can see here, it's Black Lives Matter, science is for real, women's rights, respect your mother. All these things are coming into play. It's not perfect. We know with the Women's March, there was a lot of conversation of, would you show up like this at a Black Lives Matter march? Would you show up at a Pride parade in the same way? And so I think those questions are being asked, where in the past we just like didn't talk about it or didn't look at it. So that's important. And if you want to move to the next slide. So some of the key issues, and this is, I think about, 2010, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, a heightened awareness about issues of sexual assault, and even with legislation on the books, that there's still sort of the people who sit in power and how decisions are being made and how these laws are being interpreted and enforced. Continued women's empowerment. So talking about not just like these laws need to change, but we're going to show up and use our voices in ways and collectively come together and do this. Queer, sex positive, trans inclusive, body positive. As I said, I think in many of these movements, these ideas of oppression or of fighting for your rights, people were pitted against each other. You even see it now with trans rights when they're talking about trans women in athletics. They were talking about protect our girls. I say they, meaning the people that were anti-trans athletes, it was about protect our girls. That's not how I feel about that. Like there was this sort of putting on people who are fighting for women's rights that this was counter to that, and it certainly isn't, and it doesn't have to be that way. But people look at sort of either this or that, and you can't have both. You can't have. So I think this really, the best of feminism and this fourth wave has been like, nah, we can be all these things. And if we're going to do this, we're going to tangle with it. We're going to struggle. We're going to make sure that we're using the right language. I mean, I even think about on our, when we started working on menstruation rights and things on campus, we talked about feminine care products. Well, now we're talking about menstruators and people who menstruate and, like changing the language to reflect really who we are as a community and what we want to convey. And there's also been a much more global, much broader global consciousness. So unfortunately, that came out of hearing of, cases of things that happened in India and learning about, seeing what happened to Malala, just trying to fight for her education. But I also think it really brought people together around these common issues, right? Because some of the things I was describing also impact people in other countries whose, rules and legislation and lives operate maybe differently than ours. I will tell you that oftentimes the United States is very much like, we've got this figured out, but there are many countries who have much greater progress on women's rights than the United States does. And so when we talk about this feminist movement and we talk about these things, there have been women leaders in some of the countries in Africa, like 20 plus women leaders in some of the countries. We have yet to have one in the United States. And I'm not saying that's the only marker, but it's really interesting. We tend to focus on how we're doing better, but in many ways we could learn from what other countries have done in terms of gender equity. Some of the notable individuals, Emma Solkowitz, who was known for her mattress performance. She carried a mattress around with her, talking about what happened in the story of a sexual assault. Tamara Burke, who is really the founder of the Me Too movement. Again, there's some time there where some white folks sort of usurped that conversation, but we got back to who really started that years ago. Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, the women who started the Black Lives Matter movement. And again, I love when we talk about this, it's not just creating movements and doing things to benefit women or to benefit an identity that I hold. The best leaders are folks who go beyond their own identities to advocate for areas where they may not benefit from. I'm not saying that the Black Lives Matter movement isn't beneficial to the women who started it. It certainly is. but it wasn't meaning that individually that person was going to get some new right that they didn't previously have. They were saying this can't happen and I'm sick and tired of it and I'm going to stand up and say something about it. And I think we could learn from that to remember, where do we hold power and privilege and how can we show up in places? And Chanel Miller, that was a pretty well publicized case about the sexual assault that happened to her with Brock Turner. And she's written a book about it and we've talked about it. So a lot of those things have come to the forefront. Challenges, so much is online and it's like getting the right information. We're not meeting up in person in the same ways. Movements are different. We're not quite sure how to address, we haven't learned yet. We're not there yet where we figured this all out. And it's still evolving. And then also looking at the backlash of some of these movements. The amount of legislation that is in play right now through the states, primarily attacking women's reproductive rights and body autonomy is through the roof. I mean, I can't even, I looked at like 2016, they'd had like 480 some legislation about how to control women's bodies and their functions or female bodies and their functions, and 0 about men's bodies. Now that can't just be about reproduction. That's not just about reproduction because it's not across the board. There has to be something in there about gender and about privilege and about how to control. It's about power and control. And so those are some things that we're still dealing with right now, the backlash. I mean, we're even seeing now, as we are having a Black woman put up for Supreme Court justice, some of the things that are coming out about that. Race is tangled up in there, racism, sexism, a lot of different things. And so I think that we're still learning and growing from those. So those are sort of to give you an idea of the waves of feminism. I hope it's given you something to think about, that things can be both they can, move forward with progress, but also that we can't look at it with all sunshine and rainbows, because there's also things that are problematic that we need to learn from as we continue this work. So.
Yeah, thank you, Cassie. I hope, and I think that provides a really good overview for how this has been building and what our role looks like right now in feminist leadership in college and how everybody can play a part in that. So we do want to end with just the future of the series. This was an overview of kind of why this is important, and we want to tell you what can you expect from this point on. So we are going to talk about a few of these topics. So how gender socialization shapes women in leaderships. This is a panel discussion that we're actually hosting on March 7th at noon in the Leadership Center. So we'd love to have you come out to that. Those that identify as women that have had very different experiences and how gender has shaped some of that experience, I'm really excited to hear from them, because I think that we're going to be able to identify with at least one person on that panel. Leading across campus and community, so bringing this back to what it looks like here at Kent State University, the effects of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination on gender representation in leadership. So some of those challenges that we come up against, we've talked about. How does this actually play out in our lives today? Metaphors for women in leadership, this idea of degendering leadership, and strategies, allies, and critical hope. So again, no matter where you're at on your journey in leadership, no matter what identity you hold, gender identity you hold, we hope that you can connect to some of this content and either, apply it to your own life, serve as an ally, whatever it may be. We want to keep this general enough that anybody can identify with that, and we can work on this idea of degendering leadership. So we did just want to give a quick thank you to everyone for coming out. We wish that we could be with you in person, but again, glad that you were able to tune in online. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Haley and I in the Leadership Center or Cassie over in the Women's Center. And we hope to see you at the rest of our Shake the Table series. Thank you.